The forest seemed alive that night, though in a quiet way, like it was holding its breath. 7 of us had decided to camp out in a clearing we'd found last summer, tucked behind the old church and not far from a graveyard that everyone in town whispered about. It was a little cliché, sure, but we weren't really thinking about that. We were just thrilled to be out here, away from parents and curfews, with nothing but the stars above us and the trees around us. We had set up 2 tents on the soft, slightly uneven ground, circling the fire pit we'd built with stones scavenged from the edge of the clearing. Someone had dragged a few logs over to use as makeshift seats, and we'd lit a fire just as the sun started slipping behind the tree line. The smoke spiraled upward in thin trails, mixing with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was perfect. Almost too perfect. The others were laughing, passing around a bag of marshmallows. Friend 1, always the practical one, had made sure we packed extra water and a first aid kit. Friend 2 was already telling some story about a bear attack they'd heard on the news, trying to freak us out. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help grinning. That was just Friend 2, always trying to get a rise out of people, even when they were just as jumpy as the rest of us. When the sun finally disappeared, the woods seemed to change. The shadows grew thicker, stretching and merging until they formed an almost solid wall of darkness around our clearing. It wasn't the kind of darkness you get in your room at night, with streetlights bleeding through the blinds. This was pitch black, broken only by the flicker of our fire and the faint glow of the lantern we'd hung from a branch. Somebody suggested a ghost story. Friend 1 groaned, but a few of the others cheered, so we went with it. I let someone else take the lead, settling back against one of the logs. The fire crackled and hissed as they spun a tale about a haunted church not too far from here. Supposedly, the priest had disappeared decades ago, and no one ever found him. Maybe he's still out there, Friend 2 added with a sly grin, glancing toward the shadows, watching. It was just a story, but something about it made the air feel heavier. I looked around the circle, noticing how the others had grown quieter, their faces lit in sharp relief by the firelight. Even Friend 1, always the skeptic, looked uneasy. It was stupid, but for a moment I could almost believe the woods were listening to us, waiting. At some point, we realized one of the flashlights was missing. I had seen it earlier, lying near the tents, but now it was gone. Friend 2 swore they'd put it back after using it to find their bag. We checked the immediate area but didn't find anything. Maybe you just forgot where you left it, I said, trying to sound casual. Friend 1 nodded, backing me up. It's probably under some gear. We'll find it in the morning. Still, the mood had shifted. By then the fire was starting to die down, and nobody seemed interested in keeping it going. We agreed to turn in, though I offered to stay up for a while longer. It wasn't like I could sleep yet, not with that nagging feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. The others disappeared into the tents, leaving me alone with the embers and the lantern's weak glow. The clearing felt too quiet now, like the forest itself had gone still. Every so often I thought I heard something, a faint rustle, the snap of a twig. But whenever I looked, there was nothing there, just the same trees, standing like silent sentinels around us. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the fire, but the unease was like an itch I couldn't scratch. As the night deepened, I found myself glancing toward the graveyard, half hidden in the shadows beyond our camp. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there, and yet the longer I sat, the more I felt like we weren't alone. The first sound was faint, so faint I almost convinced myself it was nothing. A twig snapping, maybe, or the soft scurry of some animal in the underbrush. But then it came again, closer this time, and I froze. My eyes scanned the edges of the clearing, but the firelight didn't reach far enough, leaving the woods shrouded in an impenetrable blackness. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. Then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. My grip tightened on the lantern's handle. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a deer or some other harmless animal. That's what I told myself anyway. Before I could decide what to do, Friend 2 poked their head out of the tent. Their face was pale, eyes wide in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" they whispered. I nodded, motioning for them to stay quiet. But Friend 2 wasn't one to stay silent. They climbed out of the tent and stood next to me, squinting into the darkness. That's when they saw it. "There," they hissed, pointing toward the trees. I followed their gaze and my stomach dropped. At first I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But then it moved. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was too far away to make out any details, but the way it stood there, so still, was unnerving. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Friend 2 grabbed my arm, their nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" they whispered, their voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted to wake the others, but another part feared making any noise that might draw the figure closer. Before we could decide, the figure stepped forward. Just one step, slow and deliberate. The firelight caught on something metallic, maybe a belt buckle or a zipper, and my heart skipped a beat. Friend 2 let out a shaky breath and started to back away. I wanted to run too, but I forced myself to stay put. If we panicked, things could get worse. The figure stopped, still half hidden by the shadows. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a chill down my spine. They weren't loud, but they carried an edge that made them feel sharper than they should have. Friend 2 turned to me, eyes wide with fear, but I couldn't look away from the figure. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. Finally, it said, "Doesn't matter. You need to leave." Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Friend 2 grabbed my arm again. "We have to wake the others," they said, their voice urgent. I nodded, finally snapping out of my trance. Together, we roused the rest of the group, explaining what had happened in hurried whispers. Friend 1 tried to brush it off, suggesting it was just some random weirdo passing through, but the fear in their eyes told a different story. The group debated what to do. Friend 1 thought we should stay put, arguing that leaving the clearing in the dark was more dangerous than staying. Friend 2, however, was adamant that we should pack up and leave immediately. The others were split, their nervous glances darting between me and the shadowy woods. As the unofficial leader, they looked to me for a decision. I didn't know what the right answer was. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the thought of trekking through the woods in the middle of the night, with that man, or whatever he was, lurking out there, was just as terrifying. "We'll stay," I finally said, my voice firmer than I felt. "But no one sleeps. We keep the fire going and stay together." The others reluctantly agreed, huddling closer to the fire. I stayed on edge, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The woods seemed quieter than before, almost unnaturally so. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though the figure didn't reappear. It was a long, sleepless night, and the unease settled deep into my bones. Morning came slowly, dragging its feet like it didn't want to arrive. None of us had slept much, and the pale light creeping into the clearing felt weak and watery, as if it couldn't quite penetrate the lingering unease from the night before. I sat by the fire, poking at the ashes with a stick, when Friend Two's startled gasp cut through the silence. "Look at this," they said, their voice trembling. We all turned toward them, clustered near one of the tents. I stood up and joined them, my stomach twisting as I saw what they were pointing at. The tent's fabric had been slashed in long, jagged cuts, like the swipe of some massive claw. But it wasn't an animal. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate. "Was it the guy from last night?" one of the others asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Friend Two nodded emphatically. "Who else could it be? He said we shouldn't be here. This is his way of warning us." Friend One knelt by the tent, inspecting the damage. "It could have been something else," they said, though their voice didn't carry much conviction. "An animal, maybe, or—" Their words trailed off as they spotted something inside the tent. Reaching in cautiously, they pulled out the missing flashlight. My heart sank. It wasn't just the fact that the flashlight had been found. It was where we found it. Someone had placed it there, inside the tent, as if they wanted us to know they'd been close. Too close. I looked around at the others, trying to gauge their reactions. Friend Two was visibly shaken, their hands trembling as they hugged themselves. The others exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado gone. "This isn't normal," Friend Two said, their voice rising. "We have to leave, right now." Some of the others nodded in agreement, but Friend One wasn't convinced. "If we leave now, we'll have to hike through the woods in daylight. What if we run into him out there? At least here we have some cover." The argument escalated quickly, with voices overlapping and tempers flaring. I tried to mediate, but the truth was, I didn't know what to do either. Leaving seemed like the logical choice, but the thought of walking through those woods, knowing someone or something was out there, was terrifying. Finally, I spoke up. "Listen, we can't stay here. The tent's been slashed, and we don't know if he's still around. But we can't panic either. We'll pack up everything we can carry and stick together. No one wanders off. We head straight for the road." The group fell silent, processing my words. One by one, they nodded. Even Friend One, though reluctant, agreed it was the best course of action. We moved quickly, shoving gear into bags and dousing the remains of the fire. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was watching us. Just as we were about to leave, Friend Two froze. "Do you hear that?" they whispered. We all went still, straining to listen. At first there was nothing. Then, faint and almost imperceptible, came the sound of whispers. They were soft, like the wind rustling through the leaves, but they didn't feel natural. They seemed to come from all around us, weaving through the trees. The whispers grew louder, though we couldn't make out any words. It was as if the forest itself was speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Friend Two grabbed my arm, their eyes wide with terror. "We need to go, now." Without another word, we started moving, our steps hurried and clumsy. The whispers followed us, growing fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the clearing. But they never quite disappeared. The slashed tent and the flashlight were burned into my mind, a chilling reminder that we were not alone in these woods. The further we went, the harder it became to keep the group together. Friend One twisted their ankle on a hidden root and had to lean on me for support. The others were jumpy, startled by every sound, every shadow. I tried to keep my focus on the path ahead, but the fear was like a weight pressing down on my chest. By the time we reached the edge of the clearing, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but we couldn't stop. The whispers might have faded, but the sense of being watched hadn't. We pushed onward, the trees closing in around us as we plunged deeper into the forest, desperate to reach the road and escape the nightmare we'd stumbled into. The forest felt endless. Every step we took seemed to pull us deeper into its shadows instead of closer to the road. The trees loomed overhead, their branches weaving together to block out most of the light. What little daylight filtered through was pale and cold, casting eerie patterns on the ground that shifted as we moved. I kept my focus on leading the group, but the tension was suffocating. Friend 1, leaning heavily on me with their injured ankle, was struggling to keep up. The others were quiet now, the earlier bickering replaced by a grim determination to get out of these woods. Even Friend 2, usually the loudest and most reactive, had fallen silent, their face pale and eyes darting nervously at every sound. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had faded to a barely audible murmur, just on the edge of hearing, but they were still there. It felt like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, threading through the trees and slipping between the gaps in our breaths. At one point, Friend 3 whispered, "Do you think it's him?" Nobody answered. I tried to keep my mind focused on practical things, keeping the group together, scanning the ground for hazards. But the fear was like a living thing inside me, clawing at my ribs. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, made my heart jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man from the clearing following us. But every time I looked, there was nothing but shadows. Then Friend 2 stopped dead in their tracks. "There," they whispered, pointing ahead. My stomach clenched as I followed their gaze. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and more trees. But then I saw it, a shape, barely visible through the thick underbrush. It was tall and thin, and it wasn't moving. "Go," I said quietly, pushing the others forward. "Stay together." Friend 2 hesitated, but the fear in my voice must have convinced them, because they started walking again. I kept my eyes on the figure as we passed, waiting for it to move, to chase us, to do something. But it didn't. It just stood there, like a part of the forest itself. We picked up the pace after that, our footsteps crunching louder against the forest floor. Friend 1 stumbled, letting out a sharp gasp as their injured ankle twisted again. "I'm fine," they insisted, though their face was twisted in pain. I slowed to help them, but the delay made me even more anxious. The whispers were getting louder again, closer. It wasn't just the whispers, though. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the forest was pressing in around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, pushed in a specific direction by something unseen. The thought made my skin crawl, but I didn't say anything. The others were scared enough already. Finally, we saw it. The faint glow of the road through the trees. Relief washed over me, so strong it almost made my knees buckle. "There," I said, my voice breaking slightly. The others saw it too, and for the first time all day, there was a spark of hope in their eyes. We broke into a clumsy run, the underbrush snagging at our legs and slowing us down. Friend 1 stumbled again, but this time they waved me off, limping as quickly as they could. The whispers faded with every step, replaced by the distant hum of cars. It felt like we were leaving a nightmare behind, the forest finally loosening its grip on us. When we burst onto the asphalt, it felt surreal. The warmth of the sun on my skin, the solid ground beneath my feet. It was like stepping into another world. We collapsed onto the road, gasping for breath and clinging to each other. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just sat there, letting the safety of the road wash over us. But even as I stared at the trees, now just a wall of green in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. The figure, the whispers, the slashed tent, they felt like they were still with us, lingering just out of sight. And deep down, I knew that whatever had been watching us in those woods hadn't forgotten. When we finally got home, it was like stepping into a different reality. The world was still spinning as if nothing had happened, but for us, everything had changed. The others scattered to their own houses, each looking pale and worn, their shoulders hunched under the weight of the night. I stood on my front porch for a long time before going inside, staring at the quiet street and listening for sounds that didn't belong. I didn't hear any whispers, but that didn't make me feel better. My parents were confused when they saw me, disheveled, scratched up, and clearly shaken. They asked what had happened, but I couldn't find the words to explain. "Just a rough night," I mumbled, brushing past them. I wasn't ready to tell anyone, not yet. Even if I tried, how could I make them understand what we'd been through? I wasn't sure I understood it myself. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the woods, his thin frame blending into the shadows, his voice echoing in my head. "You shouldn't have come here." I kept the flashlight on my nightstand, its comforting weight a small reassurance, even though I knew it wouldn't be much use against whatever we'd encountered. The next morning I called friend 2. They answered on the first ring, their voice shaky but relieved to hear mine. "I didn't sleep," they admitted. "Every time I heard the wind, I thought it was those whispers." I told them I felt the same, though I didn't mention the shadowy figure I kept seeing in my dreams. It felt too real to say out loud. As the days passed, the group tried to process what had happened in their own ways. Friend 2 became reclusive, skipping school and avoiding the rest of us. When I finally convinced them to talk, they told me they were scared of going outside, scared of seeing him again. I couldn't blame them. Every time I passed a patch of woods, my stomach twisted, and I couldn't help but quicken my pace. Friend 1, on the other hand, clung to logic like a lifeline. They insisted it had all been some bizarre prank, maybe a local messing with us or a drifter who'd stumbled across our campsite. "There's an explanation for everything," they said when we met up one afternoon. But I noticed how their eyes darted to the tree line every few minutes, how they kept their back to the wall whenever we were outside. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about the details that didn't add up, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the slashed tent and the flashlight placed inside, almost like a taunt, the figure that watched us without ever making a move. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to find some logical thread to pull, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I started writing it all down, hoping that putting the events on paper might help me make sense of them. I described every sound, every movement, every gut-wrenching moment of fear. At first it was just for me, a way to get the thoughts out of my head. But as the pages filled up, I started to wonder if sharing our story might mean something. Maybe it could be a warning, or maybe it was just a way to prove to myself that it had really happened. One afternoon I went back to the clearing. I didn't go alone. Friend 1 came with me, though they weren't happy about it. "This is a bad idea," they muttered as we stepped into the woods, the sunlight filtering weakly through the trees. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing but no less eerie. When we reached the clearing, everything looked the same, but it felt emptier, like something vital had been stripped away. The fire pit was still there, along with the remains of our tents. The slashed one lay crumpled on the ground, the cuts jagged and raw. We didn't stay long. Just being there made my skin crawl, and I could tell friend one felt the same. As we left, I glanced back at the clearing one last time, half expecting to see the man standing there, watching us. But it was empty. That night I dreamed of the forest again. The whispers were louder this time, and the man was closer, his thin frame bending toward me like he wanted to say something. I woke up gasping, the sheets tangled around me like vines. The flashlight was still on my nightstand, its beam faint but steady. I didn't turn it off for the rest of the night. Time didn't heal the way I thought it would. Days turned into weeks, but the fear lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. At first I tried to push it down, to focus on school and the normal rhythms of life. But even the simplest things felt strange now. Walking down the street, I would catch myself glancing at tree lines, looking for movement where there shouldn't be any. The woods were everywhere in this town, and they felt closer than ever. Friend 2 didn't bounce back. They stopped answering my calls, and when I showed up at their house one day, their mom told me they'd been spending most of their time in their room. "They're not themselves," she said, her voice heavy with concern. When I finally managed to talk to them, it was like talking to a ghost. They were pale and jittery, their eyes darting around the room like they were expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. Friend 1, on the other hand, seemed determined to move on. "It was just some guy," they said one afternoon as we sat in the park, far from any trees. "A weirdo, sure, but just a guy. There's no point letting it get to us." I nodded, pretending to agree, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't fit. And besides, logic didn't erase the fear. It didn't stop the dreams. The dreams were the worst part. Every night I found myself back in the forest, running through the trees with the whispers chasing me. Sometimes I saw the man, his thin frame blending into the shadows, his face obscured, but his presence unmistakable. Other times, I didn't see him at all, but I felt him there, watching, waiting. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the sound of those whispers still echoing in my ears. I started avoiding sleep, staying up late with the flashlight on and the curtains drawn. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the dreams didn't mean anything. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the fear remained. It wasn't just the man or the whispers. It was the feeling that we had crossed some invisible line, that we had seen something we weren't meant to see, and now we couldn't go back. Writing helped, at least a little. I poured everything onto the page, the sounds, the sights, the gut-wrenching fear. I described the man in detail, from his camouflaged clothes to the eerie calm in his voice. I wrote about the slashed tent and the whispers, about the way the forest seemed to close in around us. It didn't make the fear go away, but it made it feel more manageable, like I was taking control of the story instead of letting it control me. I wasn't the only one trying to make sense of what happened. Friend 1 started digging into local history, looking for any records of strange happenings in the woods near the graveyard. They found a few stories, rumors of disappearances, old legends about the church, but nothing concrete. "It's all just stories," they said, but their tone didn't carry the same confidence it used to. I think they wanted answers as much as I did, even if they wouldn't admit it. Eventually, Friend 2's family decided to move. A fresh start, their mom told me when I stopped by to say goodbye. Friend 2 hugged me tightly, their voice shaking as they whispered, "Be careful." I promised I would, though I wasn't sure what I was promising. After they left, the group felt smaller, like a piece of it was missing. We didn't talk about the woods much after that, but the silence was heavy with unspoken memories. For a while, things seemed to settle down. The dreams became less frequent, and I stopped jumping at every shadow. But the fear never completely went away. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I found myself avoiding the woods, even in daylight. The thought of stepping back into those trees made my stomach churn. Looking back, I think we all dealt with it in our own ways. Friend one threw themselves into research, searching for answers they might never find. Friend two left, hoping to leave the fear behind. And me? I kept writing, turning the memories into stories, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. But no matter how much time passed, one thing stayed the same. The feeling that the forest wasn't done with us yet. Years passed, but the memory of that night stayed with me. A shadow that stretched across everything I did. At first it was vivid and sharp, haunting my every thought. But over time, it faded to something quieter, more like a dull ache than a fresh wound. Life went on. I finished school, moved to a different town, and tried to put distance between myself and the woods. But the echoes of that night never really went away. It wasn't until years later, during a visit back home, that I felt the pull to return. I hadn't meant to go back. I was driving through town, passing familiar places that stirred old memories, when I found myself taking the road toward the forest. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the trees themselves were remembering. By the time I parked at the edge of the woods, my hands were trembling. The clearing was only a short hike from the road, but it felt like another world. I stepped carefully, the crunch of leaves underfoot loud in the stillness. The forest was quieter than I remembered. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive silence that pressed down on me with every step. I told myself I was just imagining things, that the fear was making everything seem worse than it was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reached the clearing, I froze. It looked the same, almost untouched by time. The fire pit was still there, the stones moss-covered but intact. The remains of our tents had long since disappeared, but the shape of the campsite was etched into the ground, like a scar the forest couldn't heal. I stood there for a long time, letting the memories wash over me. I could almost hear the crackle of the fire, the nervous laughter of my friends, the whispers that had chased us through the trees. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Closure, maybe. Answers. But all I felt was a deep, bone-deep unease, like I'd stepped back into a space I was never meant to return to. I crouched by the fire pit, running my fingers over the rough stones. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It was the same sound I'd heard that night, a sound that had haunted my dreams for years. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding. The forest was still, but the silence felt heavier now, more alive. I turned slowly, scanning the trees for movement. For a moment I thought I saw something, a shadow slipping between the trunks, too quick to make out. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I'd known it the moment I stepped into the woods, but now I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. The whispers grew louder, still faint, but insistent, like they were trying to draw me in. My hands shook as I fumbled for the flashlight I'd brought with me. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the shadows, but it didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, the light just made the darkness beyond it seem deeper. Finally, I reached the edge of the clearing. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving a silence that was almost worse. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I was making, just needing to get out of those trees. The road came into view, and I didn't stop until I was standing by my car, gasping for breath. I glanced back at the forest one last time, half expecting to see the man watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing there, just trees. I never went back after that. I told myself it was over, that the forest wasn't something I needed to face again. But the truth is, I think I left a part of myself there, in that clearing. A part of me that still listens for whispers in the wind, that still feels the weight of unseen eyes. I don't know what we stumbled into that night, or why it let us go. But I do know this: the forest doesn't forget. And neither do I. Even now, years later, the memory lingers. It's not just a story I tell. It's a part of me, a thread woven into the fabric of who I am. When I lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of the world around me, I sometimes think I hear it, a faint whisper, so soft it could be my imagination. But deep down, I know it's not. The forest is still out there, waiting, watching, and somewhere in its shadows, the man is too.